I think this is probably not necessary to differentiate between the two very sharply. Initially, when we began organizing as a separate discipline, it was women's studies that we focused on. And then through the 1980s and 1990s, gender studies became far more central in some ways. At one level, the difference probably rests on the fact that gender studies focuses on the relationship amongst genders. And while we initially started with the masculine and the feminine, we now have a focus on transgender as well. Also, gender studies often has much more of a focus on issues of sexuality. But having said that, it's important to remember that in most situations and in a very pragmatic way, there is a very close connection between the two, and there are overlaps and intersections. And just as one example of this, I was thinking that the Center for Women's Development Studies, which is a very renowned center in India, their journal is called Indian Journal of Gender Studies. So one can see that there is an overlap, and depending on different institutional locations or spaces, one finds the use of either gender or women's studies. It's not, as far as I'm concerned, a sharp watertight divide, and it's useful to visualize that, keep space for that flexibility and overlap. Yes, I don't think we need to regard feminism, again, getting into the debate of whether feminism is Western or Eastern is probably partly because I think once we think about India as a monolithic entity, we lose out on the diversity within what is indigenous. And there is an enormous amount of diversity in terms of region, class, caste, etc. So there is, I don't think, one common Indian perspective that we can think about. And feminism, likewise, is also extremely diverse. In fact, it is useful to think in terms of feminisms rather than a single unified monolithic feminism. Feminism to Dalit feminisms, to mainstream feminisms, which have been critiqued for their middle class, upper caste, and often mainstream Hindu perspective, etc. So those things are also worth keeping in mind. And it's also useful to remember that history as a discipline that we know of and as we practice is also not an ancient discipline. It's a discipline that has emerged in India in the colonial and the post-colonial. So in that context, again, we really do not have the scope for finely differentiating between what is indigenous and what is what comes from abroad. There is a whole way in which these differences have been blurred, and while there is the power differential involved in all of this, it's worth keeping in mind that these distinctions probably do not carry very much meaning. And when we look at the past, we always tend to look at it from our vantage point in the present, escaping from that. And in doing that, if we do use a feminist lens, it allows us for a broad scope. It allows us to have a democratic perspective, to include a whole range of themes and issues, which really enriches our historical understanding in a variety of ways. This has been, in fact, a long journey. I think in some ways it began from the late 1970s when I joined JNU to study history. And that was a turning point in many ways, because we moved into a system where instead of studying dynastic history, we were open to studying histories of political institutions. We also were open to studying different aspects of social and economic history. Having said that, at that point of time, gender was not a central category of analysis for historians. Neither were women's studies anywhere part of the academic scenario. But then mid-1970s onwards, we can see that there was the beginnings of what would emerge as the women's movement. And that was something, I think, which most of us who were interested in academics and had certain political concerns, there was no escaping from that. So then beginning from the 1980s, when I began to do my own research, one of my major concerns was how to reconcile my academic commitments and my academic interests with my interests in activism, even though I was not an activist, but I was concerned about the issues that women activists, political institutions, understanding processes whereby gender relations were shaped was something that became an ongoing interest. And I also realized that one needed to acquire skills of analyzing texts in different ways, not in the ways in which we were formally taught, but to try and understand them in other ways if that was something that was possible. And many of the initial forays that I made into gender studies were partly because of the demands coming from others in the women's movement. They felt that if I had certain skills and certain insights as somebody who was studying ancient Indian history, it was important for me to try and develop these and expand these to work towards a feminist understanding. So, for instance, works like the essay on the Kama Sutra emerged because of demands from feminist scholars who were not necessarily ancient historians, but who wanted an understanding of the text from a feminist perspective. Similarly, some of my engagements with early Buddhist texts emerged because of those kinds of dialogues and debates. So at one level, it was my own interest in ancient history, but at another level, it was also driven or shaped by the concerns of various other colleagues, friends in different disciplines in women's studies who were also interested in many of these issues and who wanted to see whether what we had internalized as the understanding of the ancient past, a kind of golden age picture, especially for the Vedic period, the extent to which this was valid or whether it needed to be interrogated, etc. So those kinds of issues were constantly being posed. And one could see that there was a necessity of addressing those within the sphere of ancient Indian history. So that, I think, was something that shaped those interests. But having said that, I think it's also important to recognize that although many of us have been intervening now for several decades with a certain kind of feminist perspective, we still have not been able to dislodge the commonsensical understanding about this, what is regarded as the status of women in the past. And commonsensically, in most middle class urban contexts, the idea that the Vedic age was a golden age for women and that there was a subsequent decline, especially with the coming in of what are very often identified as invaders, we still have not been able to dislodge that understanding, even though we have critiqued it and we've offered alternative and perhaps more complex perspectives. So I don't think we have achieved everything that we had set out to do. I think this is an interesting question because if we look at traditions emerged, there are several things that we need to keep in mind. One is that unlike mainstream Buddhism or Hinduism or Brahmanism, whatever we might want to designate that set of beliefs as, religions like Buddhism, Jainism, and perhaps some other traditions, these valued asceticism much more. So asceticism was something which was the world of the renouncer was something that was valued and was regarded as being particularly significant. And in the context in which this asceticism was valorized, there was simultaneously a perception that women were a threat to the ascetic. So there was a constant fear of female sexuality that runs through several of these traditions, whether it's Buddhism or Jainism, and in other traditions as well. So you have a certain kind of misogyny, which is common to several institutionalized religious traditions, which you would also find in the Brahmanical tradition, but you would also find that within the Brahmanic or the Vedic tradition, there was at the same time an attempt to valorize women's reproductive roles and control women's reproductive roles. So there's a mix of misogyny and other attitudes that come into play over there. The other thing that we need to keep in mind is that the renunciatory traditions always depended on lay support for their existence because they were non-productive. They depended on lay support in the form of different kinds of donations. These could be small donations every day of food, etc., or clothing, and so on. And they could also be large-scale donations, as we find being mentioned in inscriptions. And because of that, we find that there's a way in which these traditions had to negotiate with lay society in order to maintain that relationship of patronage and support. So very often we find that there is an acceptance of the values of lay society within the Buddhist or Jain tradition. And there you can see that it is almost, there is no sharp difference between the kind of understanding you would have within the Brahmanical texts and the kind of understanding you might have within the Buddhist or the Jain texts as far as lay society is concerned. So there is an acceptance of a certain kind of subordinate role for women within that. And so that comes from there. But there's also an interesting difference, and that is that even though there is a reluctance to recognize that women can be renouncers, and we find that reluctance both within Buddhism and within Jainism, we can see that there is the divide between the Digambaras and the Shvetambaras on this point. The Shvetambaras accepting that women can attain liberation, while the Digambaras do not think it is possible. What's interesting is that even with those restrictions, there is a recognition that women can attain the ultimate goal of liberation on their own independently. And there we can see a difference from the Brahmanical tradition, where there is much more emphasis on what is referred to as the Pativrata tradition, where the woman who serves her husband is the one who is supposed to be able to fulfill her dharma. There is no dharma beyond serving the husband dutifully. So the possibility of renunciation or self-realization is something for which there is no legitimate scope within that tradition. So there are differences and there are similarities. But it's perhaps useful to remember that virtually all institutionalized religious traditions tend to be more or less misogynistic, even though there might be differences in degree to the extent to which they are misogynistic. And the other thing, of course, that we need to remember is that all these religious traditions were dynamic traditions. So they kept changing over time, and they are not constant or monolithic. We find different strands within them. And what is also interesting, perhaps, is that by the time we come to the early medieval period, and in some cases even earlier, we find that almost all these traditions, whether it is Jainism or Buddhism, especially the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, they create space for the worship of goddesses. So that again is an interesting development, which probably comes partly from the Brahmanical Pauranic Hindu tradition, but could also be coming from other traditions that may be practiced in different regions by indigenous people. And those goddesses were also being adopted within what were supposed to be primarily traditions of renouncers, where there was an attitude of abandoning the world and trying to work towards self-realization. So you have those differences coming in as well, and perhaps those are significant for us. I was thinking that I probably think that there are 2 or 3 books which for me were very interesting and significant. And one of these, which is an old book, which is now almost 100 years old, it is certainly 90 years old, is this book by I.B. Horner called Women Under Primitive Buddhism. And I.B. Horner wrote this book, which appeared in 1930. It's a very interesting work because she was amongst the earliest scholars to she was very well versed in Pali, and in fact, she translated several Pali Buddhist texts as part of the Pali Text Society series. So she brought that knowledge of Pali into her study on women. And what was very interesting about her study, this is a descriptive work. She takes on Pali texts and analyzes the references to women that she finds in them. But what she did is she presented a differentiated picture of women based on the Pali sources, where women were described within the household kinship ties as well. But there were descriptions of women performing other kinds of work. So laboring women, women sex workers. So there's a whole range of descriptions of other women. And of course, she has a very elaborate description of what she calls the alms women, that is the bhikkhunis, the women who were renouncers. So this is amongst the earliest works that give us differentiated account of women based on textual traditions. And in many ways, it was a path-breaking work because it allowed us to think beyond women within the family setting. So that possibility that there were other ways of identifying women, there were other opportunities, other avenues open for women, and that there were differences amongst women was, I think, something that she established very clearly. And that, I think, was one of the remarkable achievements of that book. Subsequently, there have been several very, very interesting studies on women within the Buddhist tradition. But I think that pioneering work has a certain quality. And it's something where you can feel that the author was very deeply engaged with what she was doing. That comes through in almost everything that she wrote in that book. So that, I think, remains for me a very inspiring book. The other book, which I think has shaped the understanding of many women of our generation, especially those who opted to study ancient Indian history or ancient history in general, is the, again, very interesting work by Gerda Lerner, The Creation of Patriarchy. And Gerda Lerner remains, in many ways, a challenging historian within the Marxist feminist framework. And her trajectory is also, her personal trajectory is also interesting because she's somebody who escaped from Nazi Germany. She went through an extremely difficult period, and she began her career as somebody who was working with modern history. But it's through her engagement with modern history, and she has this very interesting set of essays in her book called The Majority Finds Its Past. But from that, she decided that she needed to go into what she regarded as the question of the origins of patriarchy, which is why the book is called The Creation of Patriarchy. And for many of us, especially when we read the book in the 1980s, it was something that really set us thinking, because for one thing, it offered the possibility of looking at gender stratification and gender relations as something that was historically contingent. In other words, it was not something that was treated as natural or given or automatic, even as Gerda Lerner engaged with the issue of biological reproduction and its implications in different scenarios, what it could have been. So there's a discussion on all of that. But nonetheless, you can see that what she also did was to create the scope for looking at patriarchal relations historically, so that it was something that had a possible beginning. And once it was thought of as having a possible beginning, one could also suggest that it would end at some point of time. So I think that was something which was very stimulating about that work. Also, theoretically, she was trying to explore and develop new categories of analysis. And one of these, which I found particularly valuable, was the fact that she insisted that in understanding class identities for women, we needed to take into account their sexual and reproductive status. So she identified, she used this category of sex class, as she called it, to suggest that even when men and women might seem to belong to the same class economically, in terms of their access to the means of production or their relations to those means of production, they were differentiated by the differential role vis-a-vis biological reproduction or procreation. And in many situations, we find that it becomes important to try and control women's sexuality and reproductive powers. And primarily because of the need to control reproduction, there are different kinds of controls on sexuality that are also imposed. So that connection between reproduction and production that she suggested was something that was really a very significant theoretical insight. And the third thing I think which she did, which was again very interesting, is that while she recognized and acknowledged the importance of production and reproduction, she also created space for suggesting that you do have other kinds of social ties that determine status for men and women and differentiate them in different ways. And the meanings of social symbols was something that she explored through her work. And stemming from that, she also drew attention to different religious traditions. And one of the things that she acknowledged is that you can have intersections between economic developments, social developments, and religious developments. But at the same time, we need to create space for recognizing that at some level, there will probably be differences amongst these as well, so that they don't always neatly match and they don't always neatly go together. And developments in different spheres can follow a different chronology, so that they are not necessarily all coinciding in terms of one single historical phase. And the very range of that book was fascinating, because it began from hunting-gathering societies and went up to the period of the Bible. So an extremely long and complex history. One could quarrel with the details of it. One could, and because she was creating an enormous synthesis, she was depending on secondary works, and not all secondary works were probably equally reliable. But nonetheless, it was an extremely interesting and stimulating exercise in terms of the wide-ranging questions she was posing and the kinds of responses that she was trying to derive. And basically, of course, as I mentioned, the fact that she was trying to historicize patriarchy was something that was particularly significant. I just wanted to mention one more book, which is in the Indian context, and this is a book of essays by Uma Chakravarti, Everyday Lives, Everyday Histories. And I think this is a book which has been, for many of us, a kind of extension of the possibilities of what Gardalana was doing in creation of patriarchy, extending them into the Indian context. And whereas Gardalana was somebody who moved from modern history to ancient history, in the case of Uma Chakravarti, she was moving the other way from ancient history into modern history. So it's a constant dialogue between past and present. And there again, one of the seminal essays which has been, I think, examined and widely cited, and deservedly so, is the one which talks about how to conceptualize Brahmanical patriarchy, because there she worked out an argument about the intersection between gender and caste identities, which in the Indian context is absolutely crucial, and the way in which gender identities are used to constitute caste identities and vice versa, and the implications that this has for women as well as for men in different situations. Also over there and elsewhere, she produced a critique of the notion of the golden age for women being in the Vedic age by again drawing attention to the way in which the evidence for laboring women, the Vedic Dasi, as she pointed out, was ignored in creating this idyllic picture. And there are several other issues that she discusses, which are very, very interesting and have stimulated a great deal of discussion, including the relationship between the householder and the renouncer. And as we were just talking about the Brahmanical Buddhist Jaina dialogues, it's interesting to see how those are resolved in different traditions in different ways. And also, like Gerda Lerner in many ways, Uma Chakrabarti has relied on a wide range of textual sources, in particular, ranging from the Brahmanical to the Buddhist, the Jataka stories, the epics. She looks at them very effectively. But she also has an ability to bring in contemporary uses of the epic, for example, in television, etc., and to build up a dialogue and a connection between past and present, which is something which is very useful. It's also something that we are constantly engaged with. So the ways of engaging with that dialogue and participating in it, there are several strategies that one can work out on the basis of what she offers us. So those, I think, are amongst the interesting works that, for me at least, I would say that these have been very influential. And perhaps your viewers would like to read them at some point of time.